went to a Catholic, must have been a funeral. Maybe it was the one out in West Kansas. They had this scamming, I thought I was going to pass out. If it wasn't that, it was something. It was
Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing.
They had a scam when they came in, you know, I think it was from the Catholic.
Like it should.
And I bet you a good $7,000.
I'm windy enough.
Remember Father Hyde?
407 years ago, our father.
Which was.
At least I might have just turned them
You covered up my thing. Yeah.
Last week, page 3, keeping the feast from last week's handout, not the new stuff this morning. What we're going to look at here is examples in the Old Testament where they kept the feast. Then we're going to look at during Jesus' lifetime when they kept the feast, and we're going to look at immediately after Christ's life in about the next 100 years where they kept the feast. And then finally we're going to look in after the end times in the millennial reign where we will still be keeping the feast. So if we go back to Exodus chapter 12. Starting in verse 14, this is where the Israelites were still slaves in Egypt, and God instituted the Passover. So this shall be a memorial to you. You shall keep the feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Okay, so this is the institution of the Passover, and you can read the rest of that. If we go to turn a couple pages and look at Exodus 13. So now the Israelites have escaped out of Egypt, and we see that in 13:3, God gave them the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And if we keep going, if we turn over to, this says Exodus 23, I'm thinking it might be Leviticus.
Sure, I didn't mess up, you know.
No, it was Exodus 23. In Exodus 23, there were 3 feasts that were established. This is the next set of notes. There were three feasts that were established. Exodus 23, starting in verse 14. 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in a year. You shall keep a feast of unleavened bread in the time appointed in the month of Abib, which we are calling Nisan. For in it you came out of Egypt. And then in 16, the Feast of the Harvest, the first fruits of your labors, and the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the year. All right, and then in Leviticus chapter 23.
I don't have the Feast of Ingathering on our calendar. Where did that come into the...
Ingathering is Tabernacles. We know that as
The Feast of Tabernacles?
Yep. And the Feast of the Harvest, we know that as Pentecost. There actually is there was a mistake in your notes. On the first page, where we under Exodus 23:14, we list these three feasts: Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Harvest, and Feast of Ingathering. That Feast of Harvest, where it says first fruits, that actually is the Feast of Harvest. That is right, but that is actually Pentecost, not first fruits.
And that's after the harvest.
That actually, it's after the barley harvest, but it's the start of the wheat harvest. And we'll get to that. Brenda, did you have any questions?
No.
Okay. All right, in Leviticus 23, we see the part of the Mosaic covenant, and we see there were several more feasts that were instituted. In 23, starting in 4, we see Passover and unleavened bread. Then in 9, we see first fruits. And in 15, we see the Feast of Weeks. 23, we see the Feast of Trumpets. 26, we see the Day of Atonement. And in 33, we see the Feast of Tabernacles. And we're going to individually look at each of these feasts eventually. But it's going to be kind of a slow road to hoe, I think. All right, so any questions about the celebration in the Old Testament?
And the Mosaic feasts were which one was that, the 23? Leviticus?
Yes.
Okay.
That's the whole list of
Okay.
6.
Of all of them.
Yeah, the 6 or 7 different feasts. Yeah. All right. So in Jesus' time period, they were still keeping the feasts. Jesus and his parents, when he was 12 years old, came to Jerusalem for Passover. We look in Luke 2. Luke 2, verses 40 and 41. His parents went to Jerusalem every year at the Feast of Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. When they had finished the days, as they returned, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem. So this is when his parents had already started for home, but Jesus stayed in the temple and he was teaching everybody in the temple, and Mary and Joseph had to turn around and go back to Jerusalem and find Jesus. In John, we see an example where Jesus and his brothers celebrated feasts. John 7, verses 1 through 8. After these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. So we're in the fall of the year for the Feast of the Tabernacles. His brothers therefore said to him, "Depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world," for even his brothers did not believe him. Then Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always ready. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify of it that its works are evil. You go up to this feast. I am not yet going to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come." When he had said these things, he remained in Galilee. The Last Supper that Jesus celebrated with his disciples is the Passover meal. If we look in Matthew 26, Matthew 26, verses 17 and 18. Now, I had a lot of difficulty this week putting this information together, because what we're going to discover as we start looking at these feasts is that the spring feasts have all been fulfilled. The fall feasts are yet to be fulfilled. But Jesus fulfilled each of these spring feasts on the day that they celebrated the feast. Okay? So, we're going to look at Passover this morning. And everybody recognizes that Christ died on Passover, right? He was hung on the cross, and he died at the time that the lambs were sacrificed in the temple for Passover. All right, so that being the case, how is it that Jesus could celebrate the Passover meal, which is what the Passover meal is they're eating the lamb that they sacrificed on the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan. So how is it that if Christ is the Passover lamb, that he could have eaten the Passover with his disciples? Are you understanding that? Because if he's going to die the same time the Passover lamb dies, he's going to be dead when everybody celebrates the Feast of Passover. So I've had a hard time reconciling all that this week. Does anybody have any ideas how?
Does it have to do something with their days? I mean, their days went from what, sun up to sundown, and then sundown to sun up.
Sundown to sundown.
Okay. So I didn't know. I mean, does it have something to do with it, maybe?
I don't think it has to do with that.
Do you know of a particular verse that says Jesus was sacrificed at the same time the lambs were sacrificed?
What was it, Paul said, Christ, our Passover has been sacrificed for us. I guess you just assume that.
Tradition has said that, but I'm not sure there's a biblical verse that says that. Therefore, tradition could be wrong.
Well, Christ, there's biblical references of Christ dying at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah, the third hour. Yeah.
Okay, and I don't know that there is any particular verse that says that the Passover lambs were sacrificed at 3 o'clock, but it's kind of implied that the evening sacrifice, the one that would have happened in what our afternoon is, would have happened between the evens on that particular day. And as we talked about last week, their evening would be the motion of the sun. So as soon as the sun starts going down, that's when their evening would have started.
Yeah.
So their evening would have started at noon, and it would have gone until the sun set at 6. So we're assuming that between the evens means between noon and 6 o'clock, or about 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
But I know tradition has always tied those two together, that he was sacrificed at the time the lambs were sacrificed. But that may not be the case. It may have been a day apart.
A couple other points to bring up here. There's some notes in a book called The Temple, written by Edersheim, that said that they would have started sacrificing lambs at least an hour earlier that day because of the numbers that they have to do.
I thought they did them every hour, but apparently not.
For Passover or for their regular?
Yeah.
Well, I think actually they did this over several days.
Did people not attend it?
What's that?
Did people not attend it? So it was not odd to do the crucifixion on the same day they were doing Passover? That would have been
Okay,
anything?
a couple things to keep in mind. the
Next day.
the people, the number of people that would have come to Jerusalem for the Passover, Josephus was talking about like 2.25 million people. And it's kind of thought that they generally said that about 10 people to the lamb. So they would have been sacrificing 200,000 lambs. Just for reference, in the United States last week, all of the number of cattle that were slaughtered was 570,000 over 6 days. So they were slaughtering 200,000 lambs in what would have taken us a half a week today.
Did all those have to be done in the temple? Was there,
Yes,
because of the specialness of it, they all had to be done in that
they had to
one
be done
place?
in the temple.
By the special people that were doing it,
It
not
had to
just
be
by
done,
regular people.
it had to be done by a rabbi.
Yeah, by special people, so they had, so think
Yeah.
about that even, you're limiting yourself, it had to be done in a certain place by a certain person.
Right. Although, maybe they were doing a whole bunch, there might have been several rabbis that could slaughter lambs at the same time. There might have been like 10 lines or however many. If there was just one lamb sacrificed at a time,
It wouldn't have worked.
yeah, think how long that would have taken. One more note that might help explain this. As Jesus and his disciples prepared to eat the Passover in accordance with the Galilean custom used by the Pharisees, and that was recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, now, so that was the Pharisees and the Galilean people. And those lambs would have been sacrificed on the 13th. On the 14th, this was the time that the Sadducees and the Judeans were sacrificing their Passover lambs. So, just as the Jewish people had a religious calendar and a civil or governmental calendar, different sects within the Jewish community had their own calendars. The Pharisees could very well have celebrated Passover on one day, and the Sadducees celebrated on a different day.
Well, Dr. Paul Wright, he's the head of the Jerusalem University College, had something here that I don't agree with, but he just to cloud the mixture a little more. It says, among the many solutions that have been offered for this chronological and conceptual difficulty, a recent and creative idea suggests that Jesus ate the Last Supper meal in Essene facilities on Mount Zion, the southern end of Jerusalem's western hill, where the Passover could be celebrated a couple of days before the officials' Passover sanctioned by the temple authorities. The Essene calendar, based on the sun, differed from the normative Jewish lunar calendar in determining the dates of the festivals. While this suggestion has some merit and many inherents, it lies Jesus too closely to the Essenes. For this most critical point in his life, and a chronological solution remains in doubt. But that's just another thing that's thrown out here.
So that would go along to support the idea that the Pharisees and the Sadducees celebrated on different days, and the Essenes celebrated on different days. There is a line of reasoning that says that the Last Supper was not a Passover meal. So there are people that believe that those were two different things. So.
Well, it's kind of interesting too, where Jesus said, I think there's that passage in John, I can't remember what that he has a desire to eat the Passover with them. It doesn't say that he did it, but he wanted to, but perhaps he wasn't going to get to. I don't know.
In Matthew, it says, my time is at hand, I will keep the Passover at your house
Okay.
with my disciples. In Matthew, verse 18, 26, 18. My time is at hand. How many days from the time that they arrested him did they put him to the cross?
It's a matter of hours.
Yeah,
Oh, hours.
it's commonly thought that they would have arrested him through the night here on what would have been Nissan 14. What we would consider Thursday night. And he would have gone through the trial through the night on Thursday, been put on the cross Friday morning, and died Friday afternoon.
Okay. You lost your
Probably, I don't know if it's even working, is it?
No. No.
I can barely hear that.
Oh.
Okay, at Pentecost in Acts 2, Pentecost is when the Holy Spirit was given to man, and this was the second feast that everybody was to assemble in Jerusalem. So in Acts 2, starting in verse 1, that's coming through, I can hear that over the speaker. When the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. So why is it that they were all together in one place? They were celebrating Pentecost in Jerusalem. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as a rushing of a mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. And there appeared to them divided tongues as a fire. And this is the Holy Spirit being given.
So they would have all, the 2 million Jews would have gone back to Jerusalem for the Pentecost, or they just would have gathered in their homes for that?
No, everybody would have reassembled in Jerusalem for Pentecost.
No wonder everyone was so afraid of them. Can you imagine getting 2 million people together to march on Washington 3 times a year? It'd make you a little nervous.
Don't dwell on that thought. Oh.
All right, now if we look after the time of Christ, in Acts 18, verse 18. So Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow. And he came to Ephesus and left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay a little longer with them, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this feast coming in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus. This would have been at the end of Paul's second mission trip, and he was hurrying back to Jerusalem to keep the feast. This would have been about 50 to 52 AD when this happened. If you turn a couple pages and look in Acts 20, we'll look in verse 6. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we joined them at Troas. So here is an example where Paul didn't make it back to Jerusalem to celebrate a feast. They celebrated this somewhere between Philippi and Troas. This would have been between 57 and 59 AD that this happened. And in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 8, us keep the feast not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So here, Paul is talking to the church in Corinth. This would have been about 55 AD. This church would have been composed mostly of Gentiles instead of Jews. And we see here that Paul is talking about keeping the feast of unleavened bread. Any questions? Okay, now let's turn back to Zechariah 14, verse 16. Back into the Old Testament. This is a prophecy made by Zechariah. It shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which come against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Okay? Now we want to look real quick at one passage in Daniel. Daniel chapter 7, verse 25. This is a vision given to Daniel during King Belshazzar's rule. And Belshazzar would have immediately followed Nebuchadnezzar. We see in chapter 7, verse 25, and this capital He that he's speaking about here as we start is Satan. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change the times and the laws. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. So, we see here that this is a prophecy by Daniel that Satan is going to try to confuse these times and these seasons that were appointed by God to keep the feasts. All right. Any questions so far?
What was the Zechariah 14:6? I didn't match up with them. Say it again, what you said. That verse was?
14:16.
Oh, 16.
There's a problem in the notes.
Oh.
It says 6, but it should be 16.
Okay, well, I couldn't find what you said.
So we know that at least Diana is awake.
I just thought it was not there right.
Well, then I have another question.
Okay.
Back on Matthew 26:17, when it says, "Now on the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, 'Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?'" But based on the chart, I thought the Passover was before the feast of unleavened bread.
The Passover is considered the preparation day for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So you can basically consider the Feast of Unleavened Bread like an 8-day time period, and the first day of that is Passover.
Can I ask a question?
Judy?
Do we have a tape recorder somewhere in the building?
I know it.
Yeah, we're recording this.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Yep. We didn't get last week's recorded, but we should be recording this week's.
Nathan, in that Daniel passage, are you sure that the he in verse 25 is Satan? The antecedent to that is another king that shall arise after some other kings, and he shall be different from the first, and shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out saints of the Most High, etc.
Okay, so maybe
I would think that's a human being rather than.
Okay,
It could very well be indwelt by Satan, probably is. But
yeah, okay. But the important point here is that capital He is not speaking of God.
right.
I've got it written in my Bible, the devil, so that would have came from one of Doug's sermons.
Mine's not capitalized.
Really?
I'm not either.
Okay.
What was that?
Both Dean and Darwin's He is not capitalized.
Well, in this one, it's the beginning of the sentence.
Yeah, mine too.
Mine's
So it
not,
would be
it's got and.
Yeah, that's what mine's doing.
Given what comes before, it's very likely the Antichrist.
That's what I wrote in my notes, that it might be the Antichrist, because this would be during the time of tribulation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
That's
what
It would be.
that time and times and a half is referring to.
So it could be the Antichrist trying to confuse the few Jews that are left, because that's when the greatest amount of Jews will be converted. And by confusing the feast, which they are still really into,
Yes.
even as of today, they're very into those things.
Yeah.
Nathan, in my notes, it says, chapter 7, 24 to 27, that they call it the Antichrist will march to power by
Okay.
subduing 3 of the 10 nations and so forth. So would that apply here?
Yes, that'd go right along with the Antichrist or this other ruler that's going to come in and appear as Christ, but he's actually not going to be. Yeah.
But we all know that the Antichrist really is just a front for the devil. So
Right.
Same thing.
it's just the devil in some sort of odd clothing.
Yeah. All right, so let's start looking at each of these feasts individually. Let's look at Passover. Start with Passover is on Nisan 14.